A racist white man calls the police on a black real estate agent because he thinks that the man is up to no good and does not belong in the neighborhood. Later, the white man is hit with karma when the police show up. Jamal Richardson parked his silver sedan in front of the house he was showing, taking a moment to appreciate the view. The afternoon sun bathed the quiet streets of Willow Creek in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Each house stood tall and proud, with trimmed hedges and perfectly painted fences, like they were straight out of a magazine spread. He took a deep breath and smiled. This was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed of: peaceful, safe, and picture-perfect. Jamal stepped out of his car, knowing that first impressions mattered. As he walked up the stone path to the front door, he noticed a few neighbors out and about. A woman was planting flowers in her garden, while a couple of kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing. Jamal nodded politely to the woman, who looked up briefly but did not return the smile. He was used to that. Not everyone was as friendly as they seemed. Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Scrolling through his messages, he found the one from Tina Davis confirming their appointment. "On my way," Tina's text read, accompanied by a smiley face emoji. Jamal smiled at the message. Tina was a first-time homebuyer, eager to find a place she could call her own. He had been working with her for a few weeks now, and she was always excited about every house they visited. He knew she would love this one. He dialed Tina's number and waited as it rang. "Hey, Tina, it's Jamal. Just wanted to let you know I'm here at the house. Take your time, no rush. It's a beautiful place. I think you'll really like it." "Great, I'm about 10 minutes away." Tina's voice crackled through the phone. "Can't wait to see it. Thanks for setting this up on such short notice." "Of course, that's what I'm here for," Jamal replied warmly. "Drive safe, and I'll see you soon." He hung up the phone and put it back in his pocket, his smile lingering. He loved this part of his job, helping people find a home where they could start new chapters of their lives. It was why he'd become a real estate agent in the first place. Jamal approached the front door, reaching for the lockbox attached to the doorknob. He punched in the code and opened it, retrieving the key. As he slipped the key into the lock, he noticed a man across the street watching him. Jamal glanced up and met the man's eyes. The man, probably in his 50s, was sitting on his porch, his gaze fixed on Jamal. His expression was hard to read, somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. Jamal nodded politely in the man's direction, then turned back to the door. The man didn't nod back. Jamal shrugged it off. He was used to being watched when he worked in neighborhoods like this one. Some people were just overly cautious, especially when it came to strangers. The door clicked open, and Jamal stepped inside. He took a quick look around the house: a spacious living room with hardwood floors, a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances, and large windows letting in plenty of natural light. It was just the kind of place Tina had been looking for. He could already picture her here, planning dinner parties and decorating the space with her vibrant style. Jamal's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Tina. "Almost there!" He walked back out onto the front porch, eager to greet her. As he waited, he noticed the man across the street was still watching him. This time, the man stood up and started walking towards him. Jamal stayed where he was, keeping his posture relaxed. He'd dealt with curious neighbors before. A friendly conversation usually set them at ease. The man stopped at the edge of the lawn, his eyes narrowing as he looked Jamal up and down. He didn't introduce himself. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice sharp. Jamal kept his tone polite. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Jamal Richardson, a real estate agent with Evergreen Realty. I'm here to show this house to a client." The man didn't seem satisfied with that answer. "Do you have any proof of that?" Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Sure, I have my business card and my ID. I can show them to you if you'd like." He reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, but the man held up his hand, stopping him. "Never mind," the man said, his voice cold. "I'll handle this my way." Before Jamal could respond, the man pulled out his phone and started dialing. Jamal watched as he walked back across the street, his back straight and his movements brisk. Jamal's heart sank as he realized what was happening. He had seen this before too many times. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. He didn't want to escalate the situation. He would handle this with patience and professionalism, just as he always did. Jamal stood on the porch, waiting, as the neighborhood continued its quiet afternoon around him. Jamal stood on the porch of the house, trying to keep his thoughts calm and focused. He had dealt with suspicious neighbors before, but there was always that uneasy feeling when things escalated. The man across the street, Paul Sanders, if Jamal remembered the name from the mailbox correctly, hadn't exactly been friendly. Jamal watched as Paul continued talking on his phone, pacing back and forth on his lawn. Jamal couldn't hear what Paul was saying, but he didn't need to. He knew the tone of that conversation, had seen it too many times. As Paul spoke, his gestures grew more animated. He pointed toward Jamal, his expression growing darker. Jamal's instincts told him to stay put, to wait and see how things played out. He didn't want to give Paul any reason to feel threatened. He took a step back and leaned against the porch railing, taking in the scenery of Willow Creek once more. A couple of joggers passed by, glancing curiously at the scene but not stopping. The woman who had been gardening earlier was now standing, her hands on her hips, watching Paul with a concerned look. The kids on their bikes had circled back, sensing that something was happening. Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw another text from Tina. "Just pulled up. Be there in a sec." He looked down the street and spotted Tina's blue SUV approaching. She waved as she parked, her face bright with excitement. Jamal forced a smile and waved back. He couldn't let her see his worry. This was her first time buying a house, and he wanted to be a positive experience. He couldn't let Paul Sanders or anyone else ruin that for her. Tina stepped out of her car, practically bouncing with energy. She was a young woman in her early 30s, with a cheerful smile and a contagious enthusiasm. She wore a yellow sundress that matched her sunny disposition. "Hey, Jamal," Tina called out, walking up the driveway. "This neighborhood is beautiful. I'm so excited to see the house." "Hey, Tina," Jamal replied, trying to match her enthusiasm. "I think you're going to love this one. It's got everything you've been looking for." Before Jamal could say more, Paul's voice cut through the air, sharp and loud. "Excuse me, you there?" Tina stopped in her tracks, turning toward the voice. Paul had hung up his phone and was now marching back toward Jamal and Tina, his face red with anger. Jamal stepped forward, placing himself between Tina and Paul. He could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. "What's going on?" Tina asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Jamal kept his eyes on Paul, speaking softly to Tina over his shoulder. "Just a neighbor with some questions. Stay calm." Paul reached the edge of the lawn, glaring at Jamal. "I've called the police," he said, his voice tight with anger. "They'll be here any minute. We'll see if you're really who you say you are." Jamal felt a flash of frustration but kept his tone even. "Sir, I've already told you, I'm a real estate agent. I'm showing this house to my client, Tina. There's no need to involve the police." Paul shook his head. "I don't know you. I don't know her," he said, nodding toward Tina. "I know the people who live in this neighborhood, and you don't belong here." Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but Tina spoke first, her voice firm. "I'm a potential buyer," she said. "Jamal is my real estate agent. There's no need for all this drama." Paul turned his glare on Tina, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," he said. "We don't need strangers coming in here causing trouble." "Trouble?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice steady. "We're not causing any trouble. We're just here to look at a house." Paul's eyes flashed. "I've seen the news," he snapped. "I know what's been happening in other neighborhoods. People like you pretending to be something you're not, scoping out houses to rob them later. I'm not going to let that happen here." Jamal took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to argue. "I'm not here to cause any trouble, Paul," he said, using the man's name to try to create some sense of familiarity. "I'm here to do my job, just like anyone else." Paul crossed his arms over his chest, unmoved. "We'll see about that," he said. "The police will sort this out." Jamal glanced at Tina, who was frowning now, her excitement replaced with concern. He felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't how he wanted her to feel about her future home. He turned back to Paul, his voice calm but firm. "I'm happy to wait for the police, but there's no need for this hostility. I'm a professional, just like you were in your career. I'm sure we can handle this like reasonable adults." Paul snorted, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see," he repeated, turning on his heel and heading back to his porch. As Paul walked away, Jamal took a deep breath, trying to ease the tightness in his chest. He hated these moments, the way they made him feel like he was on trial just for doing his job. He looked at Tina, who was watching Paul with a troubled expression. "I'm sorry about this," Jamal said softly. "This doesn't usually happen." Tina shook her head, her eyes still on Paul. "It's not your fault," she said. "Some people just can't see past their own fears. It's sad, really." Jamal nodded, appreciating her understanding. "Let's just wait here for a few minutes. Once the police arrive, I'll explain everything, and we can get back to the showing." Tina gave him a small, supportive smile. "Okay, Jamal, I trust you." Jamal felt a little of the tension leave his shoulders. Tina's trust meant a lot. As they waited, he kept his eyes on the street, watching for the police car that he knew would be coming soon. He had been through this before, and he knew he would get through it again. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on him, a reminder of the barriers that still existed, even in neighborhoods as seemingly perfect as Willow Creek. He just hoped that once this was all over, Tina would still want to see the house. Jamal stood with Tina on the porch, trying to project a sense of calm. Inside, his thoughts were racing. He knew the police would arrive soon, and he needed to handle the situation carefully. He had dealt with these misunderstandings before, but they never got easier. He glanced at Tina, who was looking down the street, clearly anxious. "Jamal, I'm sorry you have to deal with this," Tina said quietly. "It's not right." Jamal gave her a small smile, grateful for her concern. "Thanks, Tina. I've dealt with worse. Let's just stay calm and let the police do their job. Once they see my credentials, this will all be over." Tina nodded, though her frown didn't disappear. Jamal could tell she was upset, and he didn't blame her. This was supposed to be an exciting day for her, a step towards finding her first home. Instead, it had turned into a confrontation, and Jamal felt responsible, even though he knew he wasn't at fault. A police car turned the corner at the end of the street, its lights flashing. Jamal took a deep breath, bracing himself. The car slowed as it approached, and Jamal could see two officers inside. One of them, a white man with a stern face, stepped out first, followed by a female officer who stayed near the car. Paul Sanders came out of his house again, waving his arms to get the officer's attention. "Over here," he called out. "This is the man I called about." The officer, whose name tag read Officer Kelly, approached Jamal with a steady, serious expression. Jamal could feel his muscles tense, but he kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. The last thing he wanted was to appear threatening. "Good afternoon, officer," Jamal said evenly. "I'm Jamal Richardson, a real estate agent with Evergreen Realty. I'm here to show this house to my client, Tina Davis." Officer Kelly nodded but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Paul, who was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. "This is the man you called about?" Officer Kelly asked Paul. "Yes," Paul said sharply. "I've never seen him in this neighborhood before. He says he's a real estate agent, but I've never heard of him. I thought he might be trying to break in or something." Jamal could feel the frustration rising in his chest, but kept his voice calm. "Officer, I have my ID and real estate license right here. I'd be happy to show them to you." Officer Kelly turned his attention back to Jamal. "Let's see them then," he said. Jamal reached slowly into his jacket pocket, careful to make his movements deliberate. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his business card and real estate license. Officer Kelly examined them, his face impassive. "Everything looks in order," Officer Kelly said finally, handing the cards back to Jamal. "Mr. Richardson, do you have any other form of identification on you?" Jamal nodded and handed over his driver's license. The officer looked at it, then at Jamal, then back at the ID. He handed it back without a word. "Mr. Sanders," Officer Kelly said, turning to Paul, "Mr. Richardson's identification checks out. He is indeed a licensed real estate agent." Paul's face reddened, but he wasn't backing down. "I don't care what his ID says," Paul snapped. "People can fake IDs. How do we know he's not here to scope out the place, looking for an easy target?" "Sir," Jamal said, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice entirely, "I'm just trying to do my job. I'm here to show a house to my client. Nothing more." Tina stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with irritation. "Officer, I'm the client he's showing the house to. I asked Jamal to meet me here. There's nothing suspicious going on." Officer Kelly looked at Tina, then back at Paul, who was glaring at Jamal like he was waiting for him to make a wrong move. "We have to be careful," Paul insisted. "We can't just let anyone wander around here, pretending to be something they're not." Officer Kelly sighed, clearly feeling the tension in the air. He looked at Jamal again, his expression more thoughtful this time. "Mr. Richardson, would you mind if I just checked with your office to confirm everything? It's standard procedure in cases like this." Jamal nodded. "Of course, officer. You can call Evergreen Realty. They'll confirm everything." Officer Kelly took out his radio and walked a few steps away to make the call. Jamal could hear him speaking into the radio, giving his name and requesting a check on Jamal's credentials. Jamal stayed where he was, trying to remain patient, even though he could feel his pulse quickening. Paul stood there, arms still crossed, a self-satisfied look on his face. Tina shot him a glare, clearly fed up. Jamal just hoped the call would be quick so they could move past this and get back to the house showing. After a few minutes, Officer Kelly returned, his expression unreadable. "I've spoken with your office, Mr. Richardson," he said. "Everything checks out as you said. You're free to continue with your business here." "Thank you, Officer Kelly," Jamal said. He wanted to say more, to vent his frustration, but he held back. This wasn't the time for that. He just wanted to get back to work. Paul's face turned even redder. He opened his mouth to argue, but Officer Kelly held up a hand. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but there's no evidence of any wrongdoing here. Mr. Richardson is just doing his job." Paul looked like he wanted to keep arguing, but after a moment he just shook his head and stormed back toward his house. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath as he walked away. Officer Kelly turned back to Jamal and Tina, his tone softening. I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Richardson, Ms. Davis. Just trying to keep the peace, you know. Jamal nodded, managing a polite smile. I understand, officer. Thanks for your professionalism. Officer Kelly gave a curt nod, then headed back to his patrol car, his partner following. The police car pulled away, its lights flashing briefly before turning off. The street fell quiet again, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jamal turned to Tina, his shoulders sagging slightly. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said. It's not usually like this. Tina shook her head. You don't have to apologize, Jamal. You handled it well. I just wish people didn't jump to conclusions so quickly. Jamal nodded, his smile a little more genuine this time. Me too. Let's go see the house, shall we? I think you'll love it. Tina smiled, the tension in her face easing. Let's do it. As they stepped inside, Jamal took one last look at Paul's house across the street. He knew this wouldn't be the end of the matter, but for now he pushed those thoughts aside. He had a job to do and a client to make happy. That was what mattered. Jamal and Tina entered the house, and for a moment the tension outside seemed to melt away. Jamal turned on the lights in the living room, illuminating the open space and highlighting the hardwood floors. The modern kitchen gleamed under the overhead lights, and large windows allowed natural light to pour in, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Tina walked around, her earlier excitement starting to return. This place is gorgeous, Jamal, she said, running her hand along the granite countertops in the kitchen. I love the layout, and the light in here is amazing. I can already picture myself hosting dinner parties. Jamal smiled, glad to see her enthusiasm coming back. I knew you'd like it, he said. It's got everything you've been looking for, and the backyard is perfect for entertaining. Why don't we take a look? They moved toward the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard. Jamal slid the door open and they stepped out onto the patio. The backyard was spacious, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a small garden area. There was even a gazebo tucked into the corner, ideal for relaxing on warm evenings. Tina's eyes sparkled as she looked around. This is exactly what I want, she said softly. A place where I can have friends over, maybe start a garden. It's perfect. Jamal was about to respond when he heard footsteps approaching from the side of the house. He turned and saw Paul Sanders standing on the other side of the fence, glaring at them. Jamal's heart sank. He had hoped the earlier confrontation would have been enough for Paul, but it was clear he wasn't done. Before Jamal could say anything, Paul called out, his voice loud and harsh. You're still here. I thought the police would have taken care of this by now. Jamal felt his frustration bubbling up again, but kept his voice calm. Paul, the police confirmed everything is in order. I'm here to show the house to my client, Tina. There's no problem. Paul ignored Jamal and addressed Tina instead. You should be careful who you trust, he said. You never know who's pretending to be something they're not. Just because he says he's a real estate agent doesn't mean you should believe him. Tina frowned, crossing her arms. I know who Jamal is, she replied firmly. I hired him. He's my agent, and I trust him. You need to stop this, Mr. Sanders. You're making a scene. Paul's face turned an even deeper shade of red. I'm not making a scene. I'm looking out for this neighborhood, for the people who actually live here and care about it. I don't want strangers coming in and causing trouble. Jamal took a step forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. Paul, we're not here to cause any trouble. We're just doing our jobs. I understand you want to protect your community, but this isn't the way to do it. Paul scoffed, waving Jamal off. You don't understand anything about this community. You don't belong here. Jamal felt a familiar sting at Paul's words, but tried not to show it. He had heard this kind of talk before, veiled behind words like community and protection. It was always the same message, that he didn't belong, that people like him didn't belong, but he wouldn't let Paul's words get to him. Tina, however, wasn't backing down. She stepped closer to Jamal, her voice firm. Mr. Sanders, I'm buying this house because I want to live in a neighborhood that's welcoming and friendly. You're not showing me that right now. If you have a problem with me being here, then maybe this isn't the right community for me after all. Paul opened his mouth to respond, but just then the sound of another police car approaching filled the air. Everyone turned to see a second patrol car pulling up in front of the house. Jamal's stomach tightened. This was escalating quickly, far more than he had anticipated. The car came to a stop, and another officer stepped out. A tall, African-American man with a calm demeanor. His name tag read Officer Daniels. He looked from Jamal to Paul to Tina, taking in the scene before him. Good afternoon, folks, Officer Daniels said evenly. We got a call about a disturbance. What's going on here? Paul immediately launched into his complaint. This man claims to be a real estate agent, but I've never seen him before. I'm just trying to protect our neighborhood from strangers who don't belong. Officer Daniels looked at Jamal, his expression neutral. Sir, do you have your credentials with you? Jamal nodded and handed over his ID and business card again. I already spoke with Officer Kelly and he confirmed everything with my office, Jamal said. I'm here to show this house to my client, Tina Davis. We're not causing any trouble. Officer Daniels took the ID, glanced at it, then returned it to Jamal. I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Richardson, he said. He turned to Paul. Sir, I've checked Mr. Richardson's credentials and they're legitimate. There's no need for further action. Paul looked furious. This is ridiculous. You're just going to take his word for it? What if he's lying? Officer Daniels' voice remained calm but firm. Mr. Sanders, I've verified his credentials, and there's no indication of any wrongdoing. I suggest we all go about our business and let Mr. Richardson continue with his work. Paul glared at Officer Daniels, then at Jamal, before finally storming off, muttering under his breath. Jamal watched him go, a mix of relief and frustration washing over him. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but it seemed like Paul wasn't going to let things go so easily. Officer Daniels turned to Jamal and Tina, his expression softening. I'm sorry you had to deal with this, Mr. Richardson, Ms. Davis. Some people can be a little overzealous about their neighborhood security. Tina nodded, her voice calm. Thank you, Officer Daniels. We just want to look at the house in peace. Officer Daniels nodded. I understand. If there's anything else, don't hesitate to call us. He gave them a reassuring smile before heading back to his patrol car. As the police car drove away, the street fell quiet again. Jamal looked at Tina, who was still frowning slightly. Let's go inside and finish the tour, Jamal suggested gently. We'll make sure you get a good look at everything. Tina nodded, though her earlier excitement had faded. They walked back inside, Jamal closing the sliding door behind them. He led Tina through the rest of the house, pointing out the features and answering her questions, but he could feel the tension lingering in the air. Jamal knew this wasn't over. Paul's words and actions had stirred something up, not just in the neighborhood, but in Jamal himself. He tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on Tina's questions and the details of the house, but the weight of what had happened stayed with him. As they finished the tour, Tina turned to Jamal, her eyes serious. I love the house, Jamal, she said, but after what just happened, I'm not sure I want to live in a place where people think like that. Jamal nodded, understanding her concern. I get it, Tina, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that today. It's not fair, and it's not right. Tina sighed. I just want to find a place where I feel welcome, where I don't have to worry about my neighbors calling the police on me because they don't like the way I look. Jamal reached out and squeezed her shoulder. We'll find that pace, Tina. I promise. Whether it's here or somewhere else, we'll find it. Tina managed a small smile. Thanks, Jamal. I know you will. As they walked back to the front door, Jamal glanced across the street at Paul's house. The curtains in the front window shifted slightly, as if someone had been watching. Jamal turned away, his mind already thinking ahead to the next steps. He would make sure Tina found her perfect home, no matter what it took. But as he locked up the house and walked Tina to her car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. The confrontation had left a mark, not just on him and Tina, but on the entire neighborhood. And Jamal knew that sooner or later those ripples would reach everyone. Jamal locked the door to the house and handed the keys back to Tina, trying to keep his expression neutral. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, the tightness in his chest from the confrontation with Paul Sanders. As they walked back to Tina's car, the quiet of the neighborhood seemed almost mocking, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was normal. Jamal, Tina said softly as they reached her car, I'm really sorry about all this. I can't believe that man had the nerve to act like that. This was supposed to be a good day. Jamal smiled at her, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It's not your fault, Tina. You didn't do anything wrong. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens sometimes. I just hope it doesn't make you rethink looking for a house. You deserve to find the perfect home, just like anyone else. Tina looked down at the keys in her hand, her brows furrowed. It's not that I don't want to keep looking. I do. I don't want to have to deal with neighbors who are going to judge me before they even know me. Jamal nodded, understanding her hesitation. I get that. But remember, one person doesn't speak for everyone. There are plenty of people out there who are welcoming and open-minded. Don't let one bad apple spoil the whole bunch. Tina gave him a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Jamal. I appreciate that. And thank you for handling everything so professionally today. I don't know what I would have done if I were in your shoes. It's part of the job, Jamal said with a shrug, trying to downplay the frustration he still felt. Let's keep in touch, okay? We'll find you the right place. Tina nodded and climbed into her car. As she drove away, Jamal watched her go, his smile fading. He turned back toward his own car, only to see Paul Sanders standing at the edge of his lawn again, watching him. The two locked eyes for a moment, and Jamal could see the anger still simmering in Paul's expression. Jamal ignored him and started walking back to his car. He didn't get far before Paul called out to him. "Hey, this isn't over. I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows what kind of person you really are." Jamal stopped, turned slowly to face Paul. He kept his voice calm, his tone measured. "And what kind of person is that, Paul? A real estate agent doing his job?" Paul scoffed, taking a step closer. "I don't know what you're up to, but I don't trust you. People like you don't just come into places like this without a reason." Jamal felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. "Paul, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help people find homes. That's it. Why can't you understand that?" "Because it's not true," Paul snapped. "I've seen the news. I know what's happening in other places. People pretending to be agents, casing houses, robbing people blind. I'm not going to let that happen here." Jamal's patience was wearing thin. He stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on Paul's. "I'm not pretending, Paul. I'm a licensed, legitimate real estate agent. The police confirmed it. What more do you need?" Paul's face flushed with anger. "I need you to leave this neighborhood alone. We don't want your kind here." Jamal's jaw tightened. "My kind? What exactly do you mean by that?" Paul hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You know what I mean. People who don't belong. People who bring trouble." Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the sting of Paul's words. He knew arguing wouldn't change Paul's mind, wouldn't erase the ignorance and prejudice that had taken root in his heart. But he couldn't just walk away without saying something. "Paul, people like me, hardworking, honest people, belong wherever they want to be. This neighborhood isn't just for you. It's for anyone who wants to live here and be a part of the community. I'm not going to let your fear and anger push me out." Before Paul could respond, the sound of a camera shutter clicking broke the tension. Jamal and Paul both turned to see a young woman standing on the sidewalk, a camera in hand. She had a notepad tucked under her arm and wore a press badge around her neck. Jamal recognized her from the local news station. "Excuse me," she said, stepping closer. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a reporter with the Willow Creek Gazette. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Paul looked like he had swallowed something sour. "What are you doing here?" The reporter smiled politely. "I was covering a community event a few blocks away when I got a tip about a disturbance involving the police. Can either of you tell me what happened?" Jamal glanced at Paul, whose face had gone pale. He turned back to the reporter. "There was a misunderstanding. I'm a real estate agent showing a house to a client. A neighbor called the police, thinking I didn't belong here. The police confirmed my credentials and everything is fine." The reporter's eyes flicked to Paul. "And you're the neighbor who made the call?" Paul's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Jamal could see the fear and embarrassment in his eyes, the realization that his actions might become public knowledge. Paul stammered, "I was just looking out for the neighborhood. We have to be careful, with all the things you hear on the news." The reporter nodded, taking notes. "I understand, but it seems like the situation was handled peacefully. Is there anything else either of you would like to add?" Jamal shook his head. "No, that's all. I just want to do my job without any more interruptions." The reporter turned to Paul, waiting. Paul hesitated, then shook his head. No comment." "Thank you for your time," the reporter said, turning away. As she walked down the street, Jamal saw her take a few more pictures of the neighborhood, her notepad at the ready. Paul glared at Jamal. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning and heading back to his house. Jamal watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. He knew Paul's type. He wasn't going to change overnight, if at all, but at least now others would see what Jamal had been dealing with. Maybe it would make a difference. Maybe it would open some eyes. Jamal took a deep breath and walked to his car. He still had work to do, clients to meet, and houses to show. As he started the engine, he glanced at Paul's house one last time. The curtains in the front window shifted, and Jamal knew someone was watching. He drove away, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over Willow Creek. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, but Jamal knew that peace was fragile. He would keep doing his job, keep showing up, because that was the best way to push back against the fear and ignorance. He had to believe that one day things would be different. For now, he would take each step forward, one at a time. The next morning, Jamal sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. His inbox was flooded with emails, mostly from clients, but a few caught his eye. Messages from friends and colleagues who had seen the news. Jamal tapped on one from a fellow real estate agent, a short note of support. "Hey, Jamal, just saw what happened in Willow Creek. Hang in there, man. People like Paul are a dying breed, but it's still hard to deal with. If you need anything, let me know. Dave." Jamal sighed, setting his phone down. He knew the incident would attract attention, but he hadn't expected it to spread so quickly. The story was already circulating online, and the comments section was buzzing with opinions, some supportive, others not. The reporter from the Willow Creek Gazette had been thorough, capturing the essence of the confrontation and the underlying issues of racial profiling. Her article didn't shy away from calling out Paul Sanders for his behavior, but it also raised broader questions about inclusivity and the challenges faced by Black professionals in predominantly white spaces. Jamal's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Mrs. Carter, one of the longtime residents of Willow Creek. They had met a few times at community events, and she had always been friendly. Jamal, I read about what happened yesterday. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. If there's anything I can do, please let me know. This isn't how we want our neighborhood to be. Mrs. Carter. Jamal smiled at the message, grateful for the support. He quickly typed a response, thanking her for reaching out. As he put his phone down, his mind wandered to Tina. He hoped she hadn't been too discouraged by the events of the day before. He made a mental note to call her later and check in. A few hours later, Jamal found himself back in Willow Creek, driving past the house he had shown Tina. He noticed a small group of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, talking animatedly. Jamal parked his car a few houses down and got out, walking toward them. As he approached, he recognized a few familiar faces from previous interactions, Mrs. Carter among them. Jamal! Mrs. Carter called out, waving him over. I'm glad you're here. We were just talking about what happened yesterday. Jamal joined the group, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Mrs. Carter introduced him to the others, a mix of middle-aged men and women who lived on the block. Some nodded at Jamal with friendly smiles, while others looked more reserved. I just wanted to say, Mrs. Carter continued, that what Paul did was completely out of line. This neighborhood should be welcoming to everyone, no matter who they are. We can't have people like him making assumptions and causing trouble. A man standing next to Mrs. Carter, a graying gentleman named Mr. Henderson, spoke up. She's right. Paul's been here a long time, but that doesn't give him the right to harass people. This isn't the first time he's made someone feel unwelcome. It's just the first time it's gotten this much attention. Jamal nodded, appreciating their support. Thank you. I just want to do my job without any issues. My client, Tina, she was really excited about the house, but now she's not sure if she wants to live here. Another neighbor, a woman named Linda, spoke up. That's a shame. We don't want people to feel that way. I think we need to address this as a community. Maybe hold a meeting to talk about what happened and figure out how to prevent it in the future. Jamal felt a flicker of hope. A meeting could be a good start. It's important for people to hear different perspectives and understand that not everyone has the same experiences. Mrs. Carter nodded vigorously. I agree. We need to show that Willow Creek is better than this. I'll talk to the Homeowners Association and see if we can organize something soon. Jamal thanked them again for their support, feeling a sense of solidarity. As he walked back to his car, he noticed more neighbors stepping out of their homes, watching the small gathering with curiosity. He hoped that the interest would translate into action, that the incident would be a catalyst for change, not just another story that faded away. That evening, Jamal received a call from Tina. He answered, bracing himself for what she might say. Hey, Jamal. Tina's voice came through the line, sounding tired. I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday. Jamal's heart sank slightly. I know, Tina, I'm really sorry about all of it. I just want you to know that there are people in Willow Creek who want to make things right. Some of the neighbors are already talking about holding a community meeting to address what happened. Tina was quiet for a moment before she spoke. I saw the article in the Gazette. I've been reading some of the comments online too. It's encouraging to see people standing up for what's right, but it's also hard to ignore the negativity. I just don't want to move into a place where I have to constantly look over my shoulder. Jamal understood her hesitation. I get it, Tina. You deserve to feel safe and welcome in your own home. If Willow Creek doesn't feel like the right fit anymore, I'll keep looking until we find a place that does. But I want you to know that change is possible. Sometimes it starts with moments like this, even if they're uncomfortable. Tina sighed. I know. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what's best for me. I don't want to let fear dictate my decisions, but I also don't want to ignore reality. Take your time, Jamal said gently. You don't have to make any decisions right now. I'm here to help, no matter what you decide. Thanks, Jamal, Tina said. I appreciate that. I'll think about it and let you know. They said their goodbyes and Jamal hung up, feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. He believed in the potential for change, but he also knew that real progress took time. He just hoped that Tina would find a place where she felt at home, whether it was in Willow Creek or somewhere else. A few days later, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association organized a meeting to discuss the incident. Jamal was invited to attend, along with several residents who had voiced their concerns. The meeting was held at the community center, a modest building near the park. As Jamal walked into the meeting room, he saw a diverse group of neighbors gathered, some of whom he recognized, others he didn't. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of anticipation. Mrs. Carter greeted him warmly and directed him to a seat near the front. The president of the Homeowners Association, a tall woman named Barbara, called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We're here today to discuss a serious issue that occurred in our neighborhood. I'm sure most of you are aware of the incident involving Mr. Richardson, a real estate agent, and one of our residents, Mr. Sanders." Barbara continued, outlining the events and the media attention that followed. She emphasized the need for the community to address the issue openly and honestly. "We want Willow Creek to be a place where everyone feels welcome and safe," and she said. "This incident has shown us that we have work to do." Mrs. Carter raised her hand and spoke up. "I think we need to acknowledge that this isn't just about one incident. It's about the attitudes and biases that some of us may hold, even unconsciously. We should consider diversity training and inclusivity workshops to help us understand each other better." Jamal listened as more residents shared their thoughts. Some voiced support for diversity initiatives, while others were more hesitant, concerned about the neighborhood's reputation and property values. The discussions were heated at times, but overall, there was a willingness to listen and learn. Paul Sanders sat at the back of the room, silent and sullen. Jamal watched him, wondering what he was thinking. Would he admit his mistake, or would he continue to cling to his prejudices? The meeting continued, with more residents speaking up, sharing their perspectives and ideas for improvement. As the meeting drew to a close, Barbara turned to Jamal. "Mr. Richardson, would you like to say a few words?" Jamal stood, feeling the weight of the room's attention on him. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all for being here. I know this isn't an easy conversation, but it's an important one. I've worked in real estate for a long time, and I've seen how important it is for people to feel welcome in their communities. What happened the other day was difficult, but I believe it can be a catalyst for change." He paused, looking around the room. "We all want the same things: safety, security, a sense of belonging. But those things shouldn't come at the expense of others. We have to find a way to build a community where everyone feels they belong, regardless of their background or appearance. It starts with conversations like this and a willingness to look at ourselves honestly." Jamal nodded toward Mrs. Carter. "I support the idea of diversity training and inclusivity workshops. I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm willing to help in any way I can because I believe Willow Creek can be the kind of place where everyone feels at home." The room was quiet for a moment before a few people started to clap. The applause spread, and soon the entire room was clapping. Jamal felt a sense of relief mixed with cautious optimism. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. As the meeting ended, people approached Jamal to shake his hand and offer their support. Mrs. Carter gave him a warm hug, and Barbara thanked him for his words. Even Mr. Henderson, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, came over to nod his approval. Jamal left the community center feeling lighter than he had in days. There was still a lot of work to do, and not everyone in Willow Creek would be on board. But for the first time since the incident, Jamal felt hopeful that things could get better, that the ripple effects of what had happened would lead to real, lasting change. He walked back to his car, the evening air cool against his skin, and glanced up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the darkening sky. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past few days start to fade. There was still a long road ahead, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone, and that made all the difference. The days following the community meeting saw a flurry of activity in Willow Creek. News of the incident spread beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from local media and even national outlets. Jamal's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, colleagues, and even old friends who had seen the story on the news. Some of the coverage was supportive, highlighting Jamal's professionalism and the efforts to bring about positive change in the community. But there were also detractors, comments online questioning Jamal's intentions, and thinly veiled insinuations that perhaps Paul Sanders had a point. Jamal tried to focus on his work, meeting with clients and showing properties, but the incident in Willow Creek loomed over him like a cloud. He knew that change was often slow and painful, but the immediate fallout was exhausting. Still, he remained committed to the idea that what had happened could lead to something better. One morning, as Jamal was preparing for a day of showings, his phone buzzed with a notification from a news app. He glanced at it, expecting more coverage about the meeting, but the headline caught his eye. Willow Creek resident Paul Sanders faces backlash after racial profiling incident. Jamal clicked on the article, reading quickly. The piece detailed how Paul's actions had not only angered neighbors, but had also led to tangible consequences. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association had issued a formal reprimand, stating that his behavior was unacceptable and not reflective of the values of the community. More significantly, Paul was being pressured to attend mandatory sensitivity and diversity training sessions, a move supported by the majority of the neighborhood. The article also mentioned that Paul's employer, a local financial consulting firm, had taken notice of the incident. In a statement, the company emphasized their commitment to diversity and inclusion, distancing themselves from Paul's actions. Paul's part-time consulting job offer had been rescinded, citing the negative publicity as the reason. Jamal felt a mix of emotions reading the article. He didn't take pleasure in Paul's downfall, but there was a sense of justice in knowing that Paul's actions had real consequences. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Jamal knew that without consequences, behavior like Paul's would continue unchecked. This was a step toward ensuring that everyone thought twice before acting out of prejudice. Later that day, Jamal found himself back in Willow Creek for another showing. As he parked his car, he noticed Paul standing on his porch, his shoulders slumped, looking out at the street with a vacant expression. Jamal could see the toll that the past few days had taken on him. Paul looked older, more tired, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Jamal had no intention of approaching Paul, but as he stepped out of his car, Paul called out to him. "Jamal, wait," Paul said, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. Jamal turned, staying by his car. "What is it, Paul?" Paul hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for everything. I've been getting a lot of heat from the neighborhood, my job, even my own family. I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I thought I was doing the right thing." Jamal crossed his arms, looking at Paul. "And what exactly did you think you were doing, Paul? Protecting the neighborhood from someone like me? From someone who was just trying to do his job?" Paul's eyes dropped to the ground. "I don't know," he muttered. I've lived here for so long, and I've seen the changes, the news. I thought I was keeping the neighborhood safe, but now I see how wrong I was." Jamal stayed silent, letting Paul's words hang in the air. He could see the shame in Paul's eyes, the regret that had come too late. Paul took a step closer, his voice breaking. "I know my apology doesn't change anything. I'm sorry. I've lost friends over this. My own wife is mad at me. I know I messed up, and I know I can't take it back. I just want you to know that I'm sorry." Jamal took a deep breath, considering his response. He didn't want to dismiss Paul's apology, but he also didn't want to let him off too easily. "Paul, what you did hurt a lot of people, not just me. Your actions showed a lack of trust, a lack of respect. Saying you're sorry is a start, but it's not enough. You need to do better. We all do. It's about more than just words. It's about actions." Paul nodded slowly, his face lined with the weight of his mistakes. "I know. I'm going to take those diversity training sessions seriously. I don't want to be that person anymore." Jamal nodded. "Good. That's a step in the right direction. Just remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's about what you do every day. It's about being better, not just feeling bad." Paul looked up at Jamal, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Jamal, for hearing me out and for not just walking away." Jamal gave a small nod. "I believe people can change, Paul, but it's up to you to prove it." With that, Jamal turned and walked away, leaving Paul standing on his porch. As Jamal headed to the house for his showing, he felt a sense of closure. The incident had opened a wound, but perhaps it had also started the healing process, not just for Paul, but for the entire neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek began to implement changes. The Homeowners Association organized workshops on diversity and inclusivity, inviting experts to speak about understanding biases and building a more inclusive community. Attendance was high, and Jamal was invited to participate, sharing his experiences and perspectives. Mrs. Carter became a vocal advocate for change, rallying her neighbors to take part and to embrace a more open-minded approach. Tina decided to continue looking for a house, but she didn't rule out Willow Creek. She appreciated the efforts being made and felt more hopeful about the future. "I just want to live somewhere that feels like home," she told Jamal. "And I think that's possible, even here." Jamal continued to do his job, showing homes and meeting new clients. The incident with Paul had been a turning point, not just for the neighborhood, but for Jamal as well. It had reminded him of the challenges he still faced, but it had also shown him the strength of his resolve and the power of community. One afternoon, as Jamal was driving through Willow Creek, he saw Paul walking his dog. They exchanged a brief nod, a sign of acknowledgement, a small gesture of mutual understanding. It wasn't friendship, but it was a start. Jamal knew there would always be challenges, that prejudice and ignorance wouldn't disappear overnight. But he also knew that every step taken toward understanding was a step worth taking. As he drove past the familiar streets, past the houses and gardens, Jamal felt a sense of peace. Willow Creek was changing, slowly but surely, and he was a part of that change. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Jamal smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the past few weeks begin to lift. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, he felt hopeful about where it might lead.